Damon, you've been doing this kind of work for a long time. Is it still fulfilling for you to help people in such a unique way?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting journey, and it's had its challenges for sure, but it's definitely been rewarding to be able to help people that are seeking what is affecting them and how they can reclaim their health or be preventative. It's been fascinating in terms of the whole electromagnetic field dynamic to see how there are many people who really don't believe that they're affected, and others that find that out or suspect that that's the case. And I find that, especially working with families, or and even businesses, but particularly families when they're trying to support somebody who has a chronic ill condition, and they they go forth with taking care and mitigating the exposures. And it's so interesting to often hear, it's more often from the woman of the house, that we hear that the guy or some of the other family members that didn't think they were affected are feeling differently after the exposures are reduced. And that's just been the case over and over for, you know, the 20 years or so we've been doing that. And for longer, with geopathic stress, which is another type of electromagnetic energy. So yeah, it's been interesting, so yeah, there's been challenges in trying to communicate this to people who weren't open, but that's been the proof is in the pudding kind of thing. If they actually reduce exposures, it's very common to see them experience differences. And so that's kind of led me to believe that, everybody's affected. It's just to different extents. And it takes sometimes long enough uh, durations of not having the exposures to experience the difference. So I often tell people, like, if we're dealing with electric fields where they sleep and turning off circuits or something, and I will advocate just experimenting with that. So we would identify circuits elevating the electric fields where they sleep, and then they would have those. So I say, you can just turn those off and try it for a couple of weeks. And then if there's somebody who doesn't believe it's a deal, leave them on and don't tell them that you're leaving them on that night. And the next day, ask them how they slept.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So tell me about a time, and we'll start with the synthetic EMF, and then later on in our discussion, I'd like to get into the geopathic, and then also give you a chance to talk about intentional design of spaces and sort of optimizing for human interaction with the space that they live in. But with regard to the first topic, can you think of an anecdote that you might like to share about how somebody who either was electrically sensitive and knew it, or somebody who was healing from a chronic illness benefited from removing the synthetic EMF exposures?
Yeah, I have one that stands out. It was a very interesting case. Um, it stands out in my mind. There was a physician in the Twin Cities Metro who referred us a lot of his patients, and the ones that were most challenging. And he was quite an investigator himself, and he's actually the Navy Surgeon General for the Blue Angels uh, in the Navy, the fighter pilots that put on the shows. Um, and so he had seen in blood tests really high levels of atrazine in this patient's blood. And he had explored all these other, avenues to try to get her better. She'd been bedridden for 9 months, and she was just 35 years old and had a young son, and was just, not able to function. And, they'd have to put her in a wheelchair just to get her to the car to go to doctor's appointments. And she'd seen all kinds of specialists, mitochondrial specialists, the Mayo Clinic, the whole gambit. And so, he suspected that there was something going on based on working with other patients of his, that there could be EMF issues. And so we went there. And this was interesting because there's an understanding about the chemical exposures and the ability for the body to naturally detoxify and clear those chemical exposures from the body, being affected by the detox mechanisms being affected by sleep quality, and sleep quality, being so directly affected by the electric and magnetic fields and other types of synthetic fields. So sure enough, she was in a house that had old knob and tube wiring. And for those who are listening who are not familiar with that, but that's the wiring done, pre-1940s, where the wires, the hot and neutral wires, are separated by a good foot or so, and they went through the tubes, through the studs and the joists and such, with ceramic insulators, that just little ceramic tubes they would go through, and then there's little ceramic knobs that they would go around to turn corners and so forth. So the hot and the neutral wires are separated, and therefore the fields of magnetic and electric do not cancel as they should, to reduce the fields. In more modern wiring, when the wires are right next to each other and you have the same amount of current going in both directions, there's the cancellation effect. So the fields were very high for magnetic and electric fields in her space. And, she was running, like air purifier and different things in the room. So she had current drawing, so high magnetic fields, and the electric fields are just high with the voltage or the power on the circuits on. And then she was on her iPad all the time on Wi-Fi, and I discovered she had underground water field affected geopathic stress as well, right through her bed. So, it was a fairly simple mitigation in terms of just being able to give her the experience without the exposures. Was the biggest deal, was turning off those circuits that affected where she slept, and getting rid of the magnetic and electric fields, getting the Wi-Fi off. And I did some adjustments with the geopathic stress dynamics. And so, like, within a week, she was up and walking around and engaging with the family. And like week and a half, she was up and cooking meals for her son. And, and then she was starting to walk down the street. And within like 2.5 weeks, she was like riding her bike around town. I mean, and this is after 9 months in bed. So it was like, that was a pretty dramatic shift. And so it was interesting to also see, and the whole thing with the atrazine was, she lived in a small town in rural Minnesota where they were doing the crop dusting, right? And she could see the planes just, coming and spraying the chemicals over, the soybean and cornfields and such. And so, that that exposure that she got from that, her body wasn't able to clear, but with being able to sleep again, she recovered in a pretty amazing way. And it helped that she was young and 35 and all that. But yeah, so, and then there's been many others, but that one really stands out in my mind, as interesting and I think compelling in terms of, that understanding that, often, chemicals and heavy metals and different, toxins in the body are a big dynamic with the sensitivity and the body being more chronically ill, and the EMFs just exacerbating that, condition to perpetuate it in a way that can be really challenging.
Have you ever had a situation where during your assessment, somebody commented that something improved in their situation right away while you were there?
But yeah. I mean, my wife would, especially people that are in high radio frequency exposures, that's often a more acute reaction to reducing. Like, I found, being sensitive to radio frequency more than the other fields myself, just covering, the back of my neck, I with a shielding material, I felt different. And so my wife did as well. So she often had like a shawl or, scarf. And so you could tell sometimes people that are, pretty activated and sensitive. And, she would invite them, just to try to putting that on. And often they would feel more relaxed instantly. Not all the time. And sometimes if you're in high electric fields and you have a shielding material that's a conductive fabric and you're attracting more electric fields, like for some people and certain circumstances, that's not the best idea. But typically in a condo or something like that where there's lower electric fields because the wires are in metal pipes anyway, the conduit, and it's primarily a radio frequency, it can be super instant and mind-blowing to people that, are revved up and feel the shift. So yeah, and just unplugging. I mean, one example was a woman that had Parkinson's, and she was, when we got there, she was shaking so much, she would have to stabilize her body with her leg kind of wrapped around, something, like a chair leg while she was there, and not really able to talk. And we were like, is this a bad day? Should we come back? She was like, no, I want you here. And I'm like, okay, so let's do this. And measuring, all around her. And she had the cordless phone and the Wi-Fi router and the computer and all of this wireless stuff and the printer, like all central around her couch where she spent most of her day. And we simply just unplugged all the things, and from 30,000 microwatts per square meter exposure down to, I think we went down to like 150, which is still a little high, but relatively huge difference. She just stopped. Within 30 seconds, she stopped shaking totally. And then she could talk like coherently. And, that was, powerful experience. She had her, maintenance man there too, just to try to help, with some things. And he witnessed it as well. And we all just kind of, welled up with tears, like, oh my God, like she was, amazed. Interesting fact with that was also from the same physician who, we ended up helping him build a clinic that was shielded from exposures. And he dealt with a lot of, autistic kids and different people with neurological issues and so forth. And she was one of his patients, and she came in, shaking, and took like 10 minutes to get from the door to the exam room in the back. And just by being in that environment without the exposures for the time of the visit, she was able to just walk freely out without her cane. And the staff were like so excited because they'd seen her come many times, and they were like, wow. And they filmed her walking out. And so, yeah, it's interesting. And I think so many, it's just one of those things where it's not common enough knowledge that people are exposed and having this effect, and they're attributing it to different things. And sometimes this is such a huge piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, it's super gratifying, isn't it, to do this kind of work and to see the effect that it has on people. And, as you've intimated in this last anecdote, people do it to themselves, unknowingly. We have all these gadgets and conveniences that we bring into our homes, and people are just simply not aware that they're emitting a type of radiation that's never been proven to be harmless to life. And so very often you just remove those, the things they have in their home, and it can make a huge difference. So
Indeed.
I take it then you're sensitive, and how long have you known that you're electrically sensitive?
Um, I guess when I got started with it, I was able to feel, I was kind of energy sensitive anyway, just working with my own body. I started in my early 20s doing Tai Chi and Qigong. So, learning how to um, work with that subtle energy with my body for my own kind of wellness and getting my mind quiet. Outside of college, I was like, my mind's too busy, and so it kind of led me to that, and it made a huge difference. But it also then I started to feel that subtle energy, and that led me to have the interest in working with the dowsing and the geopathic stress. And then that led me to the building biology and the electromagnetic fields and the man-made stuff. And so, yeah, it made me better at my work, but yeah, it's had its challenges as well. But yeah, I can relate to people that are going through that. And just reducing exposures myself has made a huge difference. And yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'm an advocate for anybody moderating exposures, and I think anybody can feel a difference, especially over time. But yeah, I moderate it. We can't really control that completely out in the world, but we can make our homes, our offices, our spaces we spend the most time reasonably reduced, and quality of life is better as a result.
Yeah, I've talked to many people who are aware that they are electrically sensitive, and then their spouse generally claims not to be. However, when they achieve a more pristine environment for living, the person who thought they were not electrically sensitive becomes aware that, gee, when they go to town, they just don't feel so well, and they get headaches when they're exposed to wireless and things like that. Did your wife experience any of that?
Yeah, Yeah, she did as well. Yeah, I've noticed that, some people will, and with my own too, get less sensitive over time. I do think that that's often an initial journey is like, it's kind of like getting off sugar or something, right? Like you stop, you know, you stop having you reintroduced it. If you reduce the consumption or the exposure, you then when you're exposed again, you really can feel it. But over time, then you can become less sensitive and less affected. But it takes a considerable amount of time for the body to be without the exposures as much and be able, especially when you're sleeping, and to be able to detoxify, and, get the body's neurological immune system functioning more optimally. And then exposures short term are not as dramatic. So I encourage people to understand that, because often, people are I get that the people are afraid to reduce because they're like, well, I can't handle it going into the city. And it's like, well, you can improve your mental clarity and your sleep quality and your energy levels. It's worth it to be a little less sensitive, be a little more sensitive initially, and then your body gets healthier, and then you can handle it in a different way. But you're always gonna want to moderate it after that.
Yeah, and I encourage people to at least protect their sleep, um, reasoning that that's the time that the body recovers from the insults and assaults of the day, be they
Uh-huh.
chemical or electromagnetic or whatever. And kind of the thought that an exposure to any type of radiation is the intensity of the exposure times the duration. And with that idea, then you know, it makes perfect sense to have a lower environment in the home. And even if you have to go out into the burn, you know,
Yeah,
during the
yeah,
day for work.
yeah, yeah. It is. It is kind of wild to see how ubiquitous it is, right? It's everywhere, and it's so, especially the radio frequency is so saturated. And it takes a little bit of effort to create a space that doesn't have that, but it is so well worth it. And like I said, for anybody, but for anybody, especially concerned with more chronic health issues, I really think it's a critical piece that's missing in most people's, you know, health, regime. So, um, yeah,
I think it's hard
slightly.
for I think it's
Go ahead.
hard for people to relate to the fact that there is a natural electromagnetic environment, and we're replacing that bit by bit. And as you
Yes.
mentioned, the 800-pound gorilla in the room is the RF radio frequency radiation, and so uh, living things just don't seem to do well in an artificial electromagnetic environment. At least that's
Yeah.
my
Yeah.
feeling. And
And I think, well, um, the pulsing of the waves, I think, is such a big deal with the radio frequency, right? It's like it's a new signal. Every pulse, pop, pop, pop. It's a whole new signal, and the bodies, the cells, and the voltage gated calcium channels, getting activated in ways and stimulated in ways that um, are naturally supposed to warn us if something's wrong, right? Like, or that we need to adjust something. If we're getting a big influx of calcium into our cells because of an electromagnetic pulse in the body, that's supposed to say, hey, we need to change our chemical, exchanges, so that we can create the coherence that the body is supposed to sustain. And if that keeps happening, like, oh, then the body goes into freak out. It's like, okay, we need to stop, stop, stop. Something's off. And yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think a lot of people that are coming from a scientific perspective that don't understand the full scientific perspective assume that the radiation at those levels in terms of intensity is so weak that how could it possibly affect us that much? But I think the pulsing mechanism is such a big piece. And that's one thing that's really hard to quantify. And it's not part of our exposure standards. Um, we can't really quantify that enough yet, but the research is showing that that is just as big a factor as the strength of the signal, right? It's like, how fast it's pulsing and the rates, and these new generations of cell networks and stuff are pulsing faster. And but sometimes it's, I mean, there's a lot of factors in terms of how deep it penetrates the body, and does it penetrate the skin and all that stuff. But like some of these higher gigahertz signals that 5G is beginning to bring online, well, we don't have much research, but if it's the skin it's affecting, that still has a ton of nerve cells right in the skin, and you get enough going on, it'll tell the autonomic nervous system that something's up. And yeah, it's there's a lot to it.
Yeah. I kind of feel like, well, we don't have much terrain in your area, do you? And tall mountains and valleys and such, right?
Right. No, it's
Or do
pretty
you?
flat here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, so out here, I find, it's mountainous terrain, which is really good for RF if you can get down in a valley, particularly, a small one that you could control, and then nobody can, or terrestrial sources can't affect you. But then I see people buying these view lots, and where their RF radiation exposure is not that high. I mean, it's really admirable. Some places less than 5 microwatts per square meter. And yet, if I take a directional antenna, like an LTE, and rotate it, I have ubiquitous sources from 360 degrees, which tells me that, you know, every smartphone, every smart meter for miles and miles and miles away is getting up there. It's imperceptible intensities, but you've got
Uh-huh.
all that data, the transitions, the on and off with
Yeah.
the RF. And I just feel like the harm is proportional to the data content and as well as the intensity. I think that's what you were saying as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the modulation on top of the carrier wave, right? So if it's 1900 megahertz, that's the cell signals on, it's the pulsing of the data on top of that, right? Yeah. And yeah, it's I do think that that's another factor, and an important one to consider when you are measuring field strength in something like an urban environment, right? You've got, yeah, you may be at 30 microwatts per square meter in this room, but there's 1,500 different signals,
Right.
so
Right.
so yeah, I mean, it definitely is a factor, and a lot of times, just the field strength factor is not what gets a person better. I mean, my hope is that, you know, we have to do the moderation in the ways that we can to get the person less sensitive and sleeping well, and then detoxed, so that their body can handle it. If they're going to choose to live in that urban environment, that's pretty much what's required. And if they're going to, be working in an office downtown and on a cell phone all day, like if you want that life, you gotta, you know, for and you want that quality of life to continue and not the early onset dementia and all that other fun stuff that's starting to happen. Um, I think it's important to consider the quantity of different signals and being able to moderate it. That's another consideration. Yeah, I
Um,
mean, a lot of billion, I think that's the other thing about doing a spectrum analysis. And there's not being able to see kind of a spectrum of what's happening in terms of those signals rather than just this field strength itself. That's another good argument to be aware of what are they, and how many are there.
so to use a spectrum analysis on something like a RF Explorer or something more elaborate?
No, I don't have anything really more elaborate than that. And the tiny SA is a cool little instrument. Um, I don't think it's probably super accurate, but it's crudely helpful
Yeah.
and often enough to know what's generally going on. We just did a commercial job and where we shielded the cell towers on the roof of a building, and it worked well. But like the data with the tiny SA was like not really, um, worthy of sharing with the corporate clients. But it was interesting for me to like see, on top of the roof versus under the shielded space. But the actual frequency, numbers were not matching exactly and all that stuff. So, but you could see what was happening in the reduction with the shielding.
Do you have radar out in your territory, and do you see much harm from that?
No, I don't currently here in where we are in Durant, but when in the Twin Cities metro, yes. And in fact, there's some areas where there's weather radar stations and air traffic control radar stations where I saw a dramatic increase of issues with dementia with patients and clients there, and other, electrosensitivity dynamics that when they moved from that area, improved. Um, and some of those stations are just super strong. Like they just kind of, blanket a good area. So like if somebody's asking me where to live in the Twin Cities metro, I'm like, avoid this area, and this area.
Right.
This area has a whole series of 1,500-foot radio towers with all kinds of antennas, and these areas have the radar. And stay clear. I mean, the first one I think I had, and it was like 2008. I had a client that was about 3 miles from the international airport, and their daughter was having a lot of sleep issues, a lot and behavioral issues. Didn't want to go to school, and just didn't want to leave the bedroom. And I go in there, and it was pretty high. Like I was getting, there was some cell towers nearby. So, and then the radar was pulsing at like 9,000 microwatts per square meter every 5 seconds.
Mm.
We did the Y shield, the shielding the room. We put up the curtains. We did the window film, all that, and multiple layers. It still didn't get down under 3,000 because it was just there. So then we put her in a shielding canopy. Boom! All of a sudden we get to a nice low level, and then we saw the change.
Nice.
And she she just changed her personality overnight. Like she was like up and ready to go to school and like engaged and happy. And they were like, wow, this is something else. And that convinced me that the radar was a big deal. Back in that time, as a building biologist, it was a big question mark. How much does this really affect you? Dr. George Carlos, kind of looking into that stuff, saying, you need to have, a coherence of signals, much closer together, than those spaced out signals further to the body to, acknowledge that it's a problem. Like that totally disproved that theory to me. And that the radar was a big deal. So yeah, I think it is, generally like I try to like stay like 4 miles away from a big airport or so. And those radar stations, you can shield, but it's really hard. It's like the hardest thing to shield. It's just because I mean, if you think about it, it's made to just like blast and bounce all over the place, right? So it's like it's intentionally supposed to be a high intensity burst that then gives you the data of what it reflected off of. Mm-hmm. Oh, now we can identify that weather pattern because it reflected off it that way, or that spacecraft or whatever it is.
So I'm going to ask one more question about the synthetic EMF stuff, and then we'll transition with what time we have remaining, because I want to respect your time constraints this morning. What have been the effects of the electric vehicles in your area and having charging stations at home and that type of thing?
Yeah, it's interesting. I do get concerned about like the chargers and stuff as a big issue. I mean, of course, the cars themselves have so many radar and RF sources within them, and sensors and all this stuff. So, and it's really hard to turn that stuff off, right? You can't unless you crack it open, and then you're worried that you ruin a circuit that's going to run other things. Like I tried to have our Volkswagen turn off certain a cellular antenna in it, and it's on the same fuse as the airbags. So like, it's like it's that they are not engineering it in a way that's friendly to being able to choose what those exposures are. But yeah, I had I had an interesting success lately with my 2012 Toyota Highlander. There's Bluetooth coming off every 2 seconds in the radio, and I'm not really a hardware, technical guy, but I kind of put on my brave cap and watched a YouTube how to take the dashboard apart and pulled the radio out, and all little bazillions of tiny screws, took the whole radio apart, found the Bluetooth module and the antenna connected to it, and just removed it from the thing, put it all back together, and yay, no more signal, and everything worked, even my satellite radio. So I was thrilled. But yeah, it's interesting. I think I was surprised the Teslas and stuff weren't as bad with magnetic fields as I expected. But
did you use a DC magnetic field meter, or did you use the NFA 1000?
That's a good point. I didn't use a DC. Have you done that?
No, but I'm not going to go out and buy one, because I think surrounding each of those wheels, there's going to be, well, they can't help but to be a large DC field with all the current that those motors drive. But I don't think the NFA 1000 is going to cut it for.
Right.
Anyway, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to.
Yeah. No. I think it's an interesting discussion. I think it's one of the more complex issues. And then in terms of what it does to the electric fields in your house when you have it the chargers going. I've seen some of the chargers be super nasty, like in Mitsubishi one for an electric hybrid charging thing. I saw just put the dirty electricity on the oscilloscope in such a way that the whole screen just turned yellow with the amplitude spikes, and filtration didn't help a lot, just some. It's a a lot of the newer devices like that are the artifacts that they create in terms of spikes on the electrical voltage signal on the wires is like low kilohertz signals, which the whole house filters and the Stetzers and the green waves and all that stuff, even just used at the panel, are not touching very well. They help, but it's a noise that is really challenging. So, I mean, we're early in our evolution, and obviously we're going that direction. We're getting off fossil fuels, which is good, right, in the long run, but we have to do this intelligently. And usually we just, oh, look, this is the next best thing, and we just go with it before it's holistically acknowledged and tested and revised before it's released, because, money drives. So that's the challenge. But so I believe that we need to go, continue in that direction, but we need to really, create more awareness that puts pressure on the manufacturers to consider these issues and put in the proper filtration and all that stuff. It could just all be done within the equipment itself, so we don't have to add stuff that we hope helps.
So for more than, and we're going to transition here with our time remaining, but for more than 25 years, you've been involved in something called dowsing. And you kind of give a quick summary of what that is about?
Yeah. So, dowsing, there's different methods, and there's different awarenesses and previous cultures have used this. One that's more commonly known as the Masons that built the cathedrals throughout Europe and so forth. They were into the dowsing of finding anomalies in the Earth's magnetic field and actually finding beneficial ones, and where they would build a cathedral would have a more relatively, positive or higher vibrational energy that could be experienced as, that it would open people up to have a more spiritual experience in that space. And, that considering all the other factors that go into the geometry, the design and all that. But, you have the Chinese kind of had their methods, and you have the different cultures, even in South America and others. The Romans would even take the cattle and pen them off in an area and have them be there for a period of time. And then when they slaughtered the cattle, they'd look at the health of the liver, and that would determine, is this a healthy place to build a home or a building? Other kind of methods, just generally in Europe, is like, hey, let's see where the sheep bed down at night, and hey, that's probably a safe place to build. So there's different kind of methods, but I was taught using these brass rods that would turn when you would get to the edge of the field, and what helped me with being able to kind of move into that was the work with the Tai Chi and the Qigong. Kind of made me subtle energy sensitive to feel stuff, right? But the master dowser that I would work with, who taught me, I kind of had his reference of his ability to tune into the different types of fields, and like walking next to him, like, okay, now we're going to look for underground water. So if you have the the molten core of the center of the planet rotating, making this electromagnetic field. As it passes through different things in the Earth's crust, it'll change the nature of that background radiation. So if it goes through moving underground water stream, it's gonna change the nature of that radiating up through the Earth and out into the atmosphere. So it's going to be denser. It's going to have different fluctuations of frequencies based on what kind of rock it's moving through and how fast that water's moving. So if we're going to try to tune into where the water stream is, where you probably don't want to have your bed right over, the intent, it's an interesting procedure of training your body and your mind to be able to be sensitive and allow these rods to be your instrument. So it's really your own body, mind, or biofield that is doing the work, but these rods act as kind of a fine-tuning aspect of that. So your intent is when you reach the edge of the field that the rods would turn. And so then you could also then have them turn in the direction that the field is flowing. Then you want to find like what we call the center line, which is the densest aspect of the anomaly. And then he devised a method that I found worked very well, which is to use a metal rod, that would be placed perpendicular to that center line. So if the flow is flowing this way, going to the west or whatever it is, you put the rod exactly perpendicular to that center line. It makes a bubble of less density downstream when it hits the rod. And, when you douse upstream, you still pick up the field, but downstream from that, the density is so light, you don't even pick it up anymore. So there's other nuances with it, but people, the first guy I learned from would find water, and he did that for people finding wells. And so it's common for me to work like in a farm country or something, and they're like, oh yeah, my grandpa, told us where to drill for the well because, so-and-so taught him how to dowse or whatever. So that's what it's most commonly known for, is finding water. But there's other factors. There's geomagnetic grids. There's fault fields, so gaps in the Earth's crust. It will allow the radiation to come up through that gap in a more intense way. So you have a fault field and underground water field crossing at your head. You get rid of all the Wi-Fi and turn off all the circuits and everything. You're still going to have headaches all the time while you sleep. So you adjust the fields, and that's and I find a lot of times it's a piece that's missing in this community of people that are working with this kind of thing. And it's often an underlying thing that will dysregulate the autonomic nervous system, dysregulate the immune system, and make somebody sensitive to the other types of electromagnetic fields, or mold. Like some people will get really affected by very small amounts of mold, whereas other people won't detect that at all. So, but if they're always in the geopathic stress and they had a certain mold exposure, that's where, that species of mold, they might come into another environment that has it and they'll just be totally set off. So I think there's often combinations of things, right? It's not often just one thing or the other. It's there's a magnetic field, alternating magnetic field, and a radio frequency, and maybe some geopathic stress. It's a mixed bag usually that is the reality of what people are exposed to. And so I find that it's important to address all those pieces as best you can to create a healthy environment. And then when we're building new, you can basically map it out. So that's what I do a lot, is I map out what's all on a lot, what's all on a, site or acreage where you can build. And sometimes it's just a small city lot that you got to work with. But you can, if you have a small space to work with and you have control over the floor plan design, you can avoid where those anomalies would cross each other, for instance, where the bed's going to be. So often we're doing that. And there's geomagnetic grids that are very close to each other that are not necessarily bad, but they might be slightly negatively charged. Optimally, you can straddle those fields that might be every 6 by 8 feet, which in some areas are going to be more charged than others, but you can put the bed exactly where it avoids that. And you're almost building the house around that point, if that makes sense. So you can really fine tune it. And that's fun to me, is to like be able to optimize a location. And, then as you mentioned in the beginning, you can get into the space design to be most supportive of somebody being able to, for instance, see the entrances and the windows and the doorways and feel most secure, supported in the space, so that they're most relaxed. Their autonomic nervous system is in a parasympathetic state. They can observe life instead of reacting to it, and they can create what they want to create with intention. And, where I began with all this stuff was with color and design and, and art. And, I used to do murals and all that kind of stuff. And I found wanted to create healing spaces, and that was great. And that was really fun with certain clients who were ready for that. But then I found more and more of our clients had chronic health issues, or they were too stressed to be able to go to that level of refinement, so to speak, and feel the benefits of it. So then I was like, that led to the dowsing, the building biology, the reduction. And so my approach now is like, we need to get people reduced exposure, healthy space, and then you can take it. Or if they're building from new, you can do the whole thing. You can do all those pieces. And when you do all those pieces together, either you start with just clearing the negative influences and then build up to more intentional living capacity. It can be wonderful. Like if people are having a space that really supports them to subconsciously feel that they are supported in their highest good, that they are supported in creating the life that they intend, that they're supporting their family to realize their highest potential of enjoyment and wellness. That's really rewarding, because there's a higher vibrational connection to life when it's addressed in that fuller spectrum of wholeness, if that makes sense.
I often feel like dwellings that are being created, whether it's an apartment or a house in this age, are created without any sense of the physiological or mental impacts whatsoever.
Right.
And it goes much deeper than what we've talked about here today, and we don't have the time to talk about it, but there's volatile organic compounds, which can be very persistent, and there is fly ash in concrete, unless you tell them to hold the fly ash when you order it, and there's, all of the adhesives are problematic, and
yeah,
it's just a big thing. So maybe we'll just wrap up quickly. If you could tell us briefly about an intentional space for a particular client that really suited their desires and what their life was about.
Yeah. So, see, there's been a lot over the years. Now one more recently, I consulted in this way of they had a certain acreage that they acquired from the family and were able to build. So I was able to cite where would be best to position the new build. And then as you were talking about looking at the building materials and the methods to create a non-toxic space with the materials, and then look at the layout. So the layout would have to do with, how you really intend to use the spaces, not just kind of necessarily what the new architectural trends are, you know, that look cool or whatever. I mean, like some of the industrial type trends and stuff are kind of harsh energy and uh, too lifeless, so to speak. So, and I can understand that like what I try to do is like work with the person's taste, right? So you want to honor what they like, but you can also educate them as to some of these principles that are about creating balance. Like there's um, principles of doing the space design where they want to have really big bright windows and lots of bright light and all this stuff and really high ceilings in the bedroom and all this, and I'm like, well, this is a space that is for rejuvenation and intimacy. You want it to be more quiet, more receptive, more in a space where you can really go down and sleep well. And I remember the woman saying, we talked about color and stuff and the design, and she wanted to use really bright colors because it was fun and all this. And I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about this. And, kind of looked at what would resonate. And I talked her into doing, because she really needed to like, so like, what would be most optimal, consider something like more earthy that's got a little brown in it. And I wouldn't suggest that for everybody, right? But for her, like, she really needed this kind of like earthy, like, come down, be grounded, relax, let in, and be receptive. So she ended up doing kind of it wasn't like a dark brown or anything, but it was a brown kind of cocoa kind of vibe in there. And she just called me after she got in there, and she's sleeping better than she ever had. And she said, I can't tell you how glad I am you talked me into doing that, because now I have the vitality when I wake up to go. And for me, like, that was the visual part was really important for her, and being able to, so there's just like, there's so many, pieces of, and even choosing kind of, the artwork that may symbolize something to you. Like, once you set it there and have intention with it, on a subconscious level, that you've addressed meaning to it. And that meaning kind of reflects to you that you have this space that's kind of a living physical affirmation of what has meaning and purpose in your life being reflected back to you. And when that happens, there's something about feeling, really at home and really supported that you don't get from just a space that you plop down and or just enter into and set up shop and trudge through life. There's a mindfulness that can be supported in that creation that just has meaning to it. And that's fun. That's fun to see people, lit up. They're not only not, affected by these negative things we're talking about, but they're actually charged up positively to be like, like, I feel like I've arrived. Like, I finally have my home that makes me, or supports me to be my best self. So that's fun.
It's great. That's a wonderful note to end on as well. Damon, where can people get in touch with you and your work?
So yeah, my website be probably the best way. That's just intentional, intentional, intentional environment, INVIRONMENT.com. It's a long name. I've had it for 27 years. I was like, I should really make that a shorter website, but an email address. But anyway, it's still intentionalenvironment.com. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, you bet. And I'll put it in the notes so people will have a handy link to that. Damon, thank
So
you so much for the work that you do and for spending time with us today. Appreciate it.
you're welcome. Thank you, Keith, for the work that you're doing and sharing this and making this knowledge that you're circulating in the world available. So appreciate you too.